Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Sober Curator, the Mindful Binge, and movie nights. We love watching movies and documentaries, and then we love talking about them. Today, if you can't tell, we are talking about the new Pamela Anderson documentary that came out on Netflix in January. It follows the life of pop culture icon Pamela Anderson, including never seen before archival footage and personal journeys. I am joined today with Sober Curators Annalisa and Megan, and I will let them introduce themselves now.
Hi, I'm super excited to talk about everything Pamela. I really enjoyed this documentary on many levels. I'm a wellness coach and consultant and a sober curator. I write for Enough is a Feast, and I am a wellness junkie. Let's face it, I'm a mom of two beautiful boys, and I've been sober for 5 years.
I am Annalisa, and I am the one of two in-house astrologer tarot readers for the Sober Curator. I am currently a housewife as well and a retired dog trainer. I don't know if I can use the word retired yet, but it feels like I'm retired right now. I also really love Pamela Anderson, and I kind of feel like I never was out with my love for Pamela Anderson because growing up, I felt like she was not a feminist icon in the way that I was supposed to, be catering my life towards not idealizing fake boobs and blonde women, but I've always loved fake boobs, blonde women. And I think Pamela Anderson has been one of my favorites besides Dolly Parton. And part of the thing I always gravitated towards with Pamela Anderson was she just felt like a very kind person, and her animal advocacy. She always loved dogs. She was always kind of, pro PETA and vegetarianism, and her rock and roll kind of crazy side. I also have that in me as well. Granted, why I'm sober. So I just think like her whole thing, I just really enjoyed. And I mean, let's face it, like I moved to Southern California. The 90s was like Baywatch, all that stuff really total 90210, Baywatch, all that stuff was in my psyche as a kid. And I just feel like it shaped a lot of the things that I idealized as a kid about Southern California. And I love Southern California. So her whole vibe like that, I think is just, I don't know. I like it. I don't hate it. I feel like I like the all natural feminist beauty side of things, but then there's something about women that totally create this character and go all in with it that I also really adore and love. So I like her. And I don't have any guilt or shame about it now.
I'm so glad that you were able to come out of your Pamela Anderson closet and just like profess public love. I've been obsessed with her also since I was a teenager, during the 90s and the Baywatch and the 90210 and all of that. And I like, if I could look like anyone, I had always wanted to look like her. I can remember when I was dating my son's father that's when I was really, really obsessed with her. And I remember one time him saying to me like, "Oh, you're so much prettier than she is." And I was like, "Whatever, dude, you don't like, I'm already a sure thing. Like you don't need to say that." Like I've just always been enamored with her. And I don't know that love has ever like really gone away. So I was really excited when the Pam and Tommy series came out last year. So hopefully we can even talk about that a little bit today, but I was really looking forward to this documentary. And so before we get into talking about it, Annalisa, I know that you have done the star charts for both Pam and Tommy. So maybe you should start with those first so we can get an astrological viewpoint of why they are the way they are. And then we can dig into the goodness that was the documentary, A Love Story.
Yes, totally. I'm excited. I'll share my screen, but I'm sure you feel some, I'm always bad at saying this word, but camaraderie with Pamela since she's a fellow Cancer like you. All right, we're gonna start with Pam. Elise is sharing the chart. My screen sharing did not work, so my internet went down. So I'm going to do my best to look at my computer and look at it from my end and then talk about it. And Elise, if you want to use the cursor to kind of drag around where I'm talking about as best you can, that's cool. But if not, that's all good too. So Pamela Anderson was born in Ladysmith, British Columbia on July 1st, 1967 at 4:08 a.m. She is a Cancer sun, and the sun symbol is the circle with the dot in the middle that's kind of on the left side of the chart. And she's 8 degrees Cancer in the first house. The first house represents the self and the identity. So the fact that she has her sun placement here means that she has a pretty, she chooses herself. Her identity, her relationship to herself is important to her. And I think that one of the things that we don't really get from her in some of the ways that she talks is just how much autonomy she actually needs. She doesn't really talk about that. And, you know, people that have Cancer in their chart and then a lot of personal placements that are more private, the bottom half of her chart is more filled. So she has kind of a really extensive internal world, especially being a Cancer. But I think it's kind of interesting because she comes off as somebody that in the documentary, or the way she talks about herself, is wanting more codependent relationships, but she's not really wired to be super codependent. She's actually wired to be really independent, which I think is probably something that people that know her see. But in her mind, she wants this romantic kind of, you know, codependent love affair, but she actually isn't really wired to be super codependent. So I found that really interesting about this chart. She also has a Gemini rising. So she's got a Cancer sun, Gemini rising, and then her moon placement is in Aries. And one of the ways that she kind of portrays herself, I think a lot of the way she comes off is the Gemini rising and the Aries moon when it comes to her social kind of, I guess the way that I think about Gemini energy is like a butterfly. So like Geminis are very social, outgoing, but they also have a really deep internal world. And they also have really short attention spans, and they get bored very easily, and they're curious, and they like to learn a lot. They like to jump around to a lot of different little things. And so I think that part of her personality we see a lot in the Pamela documentary in terms of, you know, her desire to kind of explore outside of her home life, because Cancers can also be very homebody-ish. And depending on how a Cancer is wired, they're not always likely to want to leave the nest and go do all these things. But having a Gemini rising placement and an Aries moon placement is kind of where that more risk taker, bold explorer type energy that she has is, you know, kind of more out there. The placement of her moon is at the top of the chart, which that one's kind of easy to see because it's the moon placement, like the crescent moon is the symbol for it. And it's in the 11th house, which is the house that rules friendship circles, group organizations, and kind of the way that we relate to other people in a very social way or a political way. And so people that have a lot of placements here, that's a big value system for them, like having groups that they associate with that are in line with what they want to do or feel that they want to be in alignment with. Those are value systems for them. So her moon, you know, the moon is what we emotionally need, is basically having groups of people that she feels like she can connect with. But in Aries is a very independent and autonomous placement too. And Aries people tend to also be kind of impatient and impulsive and like to explore different things and change different things. So she might also be kind of one of those people where she's always kind of seeking these peak experiences socially, or people that are adventurous and kind of exciting. So I'm kind of saying that as a precursor to some of the people she dated and the era of history that she was a part of, and, you know, being on the Howard Stern show and being around these people that are, you know, kind of pushing the societal envelope. Like Aries is definitely the charge ahead, like, I'm going to do this stuff. And she talks about that with her financial stuff too in the documentary, where she's like, I've never really been that grounded with money. She doesn't have a lot grounding her chart. You know, she's definitely like this experience seeker in just kind of wanting these, fun kind of, oh yeah, that sounds good right now, I'm gonna go do it, and doesn't really think about it, thinks about it later. That could be a very Gemini Aries signature for sure, especially Gemini. The other thing that's in her 11th house, she has Lilith, Saturn, and Chiron here. And so some of the way that she has trauma publicly, and with people that have been close to her, Chiron is a wound in the chart. It's at 29 degrees Pisces. People with Chiron in the 11th house tend to have wounds or issues when it comes to feeling like they belong. And so that's also something that I think she kind of talks about in the documentary a little bit. And that placement in the chart is what points to that. Saturn also has a relationship to our parents and our specifically usually our father. And so there's, Saturn and Aries kind of can have issues with authority. Saturn in Aries, the journey is becoming your own authority and having more confidence in asserting yourself. And so I think that was something too that we saw later in the documentary too, in terms of her figuring that out. A couple things about her, like a big theme in the documentary was her quest for love, Pamela, a love story. So we're going to talk about Tommy Lee and how he varies from her, and the things that were like obvious why they ended up together, the things that make sense why it didn't work out. But for her, just talking about her love language, she has Venus and Juno, which are two of the placements that represent what we want in relationships and how we function in relationships. She has those in Leo in the 4th house. And the 4th house is the house that Cancer traditionally rules. So all those Cancer themes that have to do with nurturing, traditional home family structure, kind of this motherly quality, that family life is really important to her. That is definitely a value system in her chart. And she definitely talked about that in the documentary. She chose her kids first. She also really wanted to keep a good relationship with her family, even with the trauma that she had. And she wanted to create that for herself. And so that's a love language for her that's really important to her to have, and to be a nurturing person as a Cancer, but also in her Venus Juno placements. Leo itself is a very romantic, passionate sign, and Leo, Venus or Juno placements demand a lot of validation from romantic partnership. So they need to be told how much they're valued. They need to be told how beautiful they are. They need to be told that they're the most important thing in the world to their partner. And so if that Leo Venus or Leo dominant person isn't getting that from a relationship, the relationship's not going to probably do very well. So she's definitely, I don't like using the word needy, but she's definitely in a romantic partnership. She needs a lot of nurturing emotionally and a lot of validation from that partner on her looks and who she is, and there needs to be shared value systems, and the romance needs to kind of be a constant. Leo people are very romantic, so that's something. The other thing too, she has Mars in the 5th house, which is the house that Leo traditionally rules. She has it in Libra. Mars is actually in detriment in Libra because it rules Aries, and it's opposite her moon. So one of the things we don't see in the documentary, or maybe we don't hear about, is she probably has a bit of a temper that only people that are close to her see. And so to me, looking at her chart, I'm like, Pamela is not probably as innocent in some of the ways that she portrays. She probably has a bit of a temper and reactionary nature, and something that is equally very unhinged at times, that I think she's really good at portraying a different kind of softer image, which would be the Cancer side of things. And Gemini can kind of put on a little bit more of a show of like, hey, I'm not intense. I'm fun. But the Aries moon, the Mars placement, and even some of the Leo placements, there's definitely a lot of, like, she's strong. She's not, you don't mess with Pamela, I have a feeling. So not saying it justifies anything that happened to her, but I'm pretty sure that she's got some fight in there for sure. She's not just a little wisp, so that's kind of just a little bit about just who she is from an astrology perspective. And with Tommy, we don't have a birth time for him. So we don't know his rising sign. And we also don't know if these house placements are accurate. So we're not going to talk about his houses. We're just going to talk about some of his planetary placements and how it played a role with Pamela, because that's on brand for the documentary and the series. So Tommy Lee was born in Athens, Greece, which was news to me. That's pretty interesting. On October 3rd, 1962. So he's a Libra, and he has Mercury conjunct his sun. And so one of the things that's interesting is that he has his sun and Mercury in Libra, and she has her sun and Mercury in Cancer. And those placements actually make what's called a square to each other. And a square is tension. So they're not speaking the same language. And there's definitely tension in how they relate to the world and the way that they communicate. They just communicate in totally different ways. Libra is way more detached and sees kind of both sides of things and wants, kind of like how he was a little complacent during the trial, when they were going through all of that. That's a very Libra way of kind of being about things. And she, has Mercury in Cancer, which Mercury in Cancer is really emotional and takes things personally very, very easily, even if it wasn't intended that way. And needs to cry and needs to be more emotional than Libra does. Libra tends to be more detached and doesn't need to be quite as emotional. So that's an area of contention in the relationship automatically. He has his moon in Sagittarius, which is actually really compatible with an Aries moon. Fire likes fire. So their moons don't make an exact trine to each other, but they are in fire signs. So we can see that attraction because her emotional needs in Aries are very like, I want to explore. I want to have fun. I want to be crazy and spontaneous and rambunctious, and Sagittarius is there for that. Sagittarius is like, hell yeah, me too. So the fact that they met and obviously he stalked her and followed her to Mexico, but that would be totally what a Leo Venus would want and what an Aries moon would want. They would want that person to come up and be like, hey, I'm obsessed with you, let's go do some crazy stuff. That's super fire sign. So there's a lot of compatibility there. He also, I took some notes actually. So the other thing that he has, Tommy is a Scorpio. What does he have in Scorpio? He has a Scorpio Venus at 21 degrees. And that's actually, so his love language is Scorpio. And Scorpio love language can be really possessive and very jealous. And so when I saw that he had Venus in Scorpio, it was like, okay, well, there's all that stuff that we see. He did not want her in certain situations. They show in the documentary like how she was working on the set of Baywatch and how he'd come in and flip out. Like that's so Venus in Scorpio or Venus in Taurus, like they see their significant other as a possession or as theirs. And if there's things that are making them jealous or they're upset about, that's that. And she obviously, having an Aries moon, needs autonomy and independence. Having her sun in the first house, which is traditionally ruled by Aries, needs autonomy and independence. So that level of jealousy and possessiveness doesn't work. The other thing is that his Venus in Scorpio with her Venus in Leo is also making a square. The similarities between Scorpio and Leo is the passion. So the fiery, sexual, obsessive passion, Leo and Scorpio both have and both love, but they're still in conflict with each other having that square because they do it in totally different ways. And so that's something where when it was hot, it was hot. And when it was tension, it was explosive. So that's also why we see that passion kind of turn into that because of that square. His Venus is also conjunct Pamela's Neptune. So his Venus at 21 degrees Scorpio is on her Neptune. And Neptune and Venus are really great when it comes to spinning a fantasy. So the fact that they had this dreamy romantic life that was kind of in the public eye, and that they were building this dream house together, but that they kind of overlooked some of the other more tangible issues. That to me was very symbolic that she overlooked a lot of stuff. Neptune rules illusions and deceptions. It rules fantasy. It also rules drugs and alcohol. And so their whole thing with the drugs, the alcohol, the fantasy, like the Venus and Neptune together was just so obvious that that was in the mix. Now, when it came to them fighting, there's some really specific signatures in terms of fights. So, you know, we could blame Tommy for everything, but I think that knowing Pamela's chart and knowing some of these placements, some of the conflict they had was probably going to be inevitable regardless of the domestic violence. Like this probably just wasn't going to work out. Tommy has Mars conjunct Pamela's Mercury. So Tommy's Mars is at 25 degrees Cancer, which means it's on top of her Mercury placement. And Mars is assertion, and it rules, you know, war, and it's the Scorpio Aries ruler. It's great when it comes to, you know, kind of wanting to drive things forward. It's ambitious, it's passionate, but it's also the planet that rules conflict, and it's the fight. And so if you have your fight planet on somebody else's Mercury, which is their communication, that's a lot of energy there if you're having a problem. Like it kind of elevates everything. And then her Mercury placement, her Mars placement, her Mars in Libra at 22 degrees is on top of his 18-degree Mercury in Libra. So they both have each other's Marses conjunct each other's communication planets, Mercury. Yeah. And so to me, that was just an obvious, you guys are going to fight. Like, there's going to be problems. You guys are going to have great makeup sex, but you're going to be fighting a lot, you know? So it's interesting because I think as women, we tend to see men that have these domestic violence charges and these kinds of things. And it's just like automatically it's all that guy's fault and he's bad. And I agree with that totally. But I think that Pamela definitely, you know, has her own temper, and there's definitely some explosive tendencies in this relationship. He also has some placements on her North Node, her karmic path. His Pluto and Uranus is on top of her North Node, which would symbolize that this was a karmic relationship that was going to have some painful lessons around it, some traumatic lessons around it. And I don't want to say everybody with that means it would be bad necessarily, but it usually means there's healing or learning happening in a karmic way around things that are really painful and difficult. And so I think the fact that they went through so much together that way is pretty obvious that this was a relationship that was destined to kind of go through those things together. And they did have a lot of things that were mutually receptive in understanding each other. So I don't know about you guys. I guess we can segue out of the astrology and talk about the documentary and the bio series. But I remember at the end just feeling so sad that they didn't work out. Like I remember kind of the way she talks about it, and then looking at the charts, it's just like, I don't think they could have made it work out with some of that. But the passion and the romance and the, you know, the love, I don't know if it really was love, the lust part of it, I can understand, like that was so elevated and supported in the astrology that I can see why it would have been hard to find that again. But it seems like if we get into the addiction stuff, that she's kind of maybe chasing more of that feeling based off of her own trauma with her upbringing than, real love. What do you guys think?
Oh, that's so interesting. I love it. I love it when you are in your area of genius, because I could just sit here and just pop the popcorn and listen to it, especially when you're talking about a couple who I have, we've followed over the years, and, listening to what you explain and then marrying that with what we saw in the documentary and adding to what we watched in pop culture headlines growing up, like it all makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does.
Yeah, I really took away your point there that, her addiction was the fairy tale love, like the lust, almost, maybe even like that stage of a relationship. Can't even remember how many marriages she's had, but I think I stopped paying attention to the headlines kind of after the sex tape, like, because there was a lot in that documentary where I was like, wow, I've completely lost track of this story. And yeah, I can't really pinpoint what it was about the documentary that made me think, like, I really enjoyed it overall, but to your point that I feel like there's some aspects of the story that are missing, like it's very clear it's her curated perspective. And yeah, like I would have never positioned her as quite so soft spoken. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised that, again, like not condemning any sort of domestic violence, but the reality is couples fight, and sometimes it's it can really escalate quickly, particularly when drugs and alcohol are involved. And I mean, particularly when it's between parents that have kids together, it's even, because that's kind of was my takeaway. Not so much that I wanted them to get back together, is that it was just so sad that they obviously had this incredible spark in chemistry and this beautiful thing, and these beautiful boys came out of it, but they didn't really experience the beautiful part of their parents' relationship personally. So yeah, loved hearing the astrology side, because it just seemed to back everything up, give more depth.
I'm curious, Megan, what you thought of her son's involvement in making the documentary. And like, I mean, that's, as a mother of a son, I don't know.
I think, well, sort of back up a bit. First, I thought it was fascinating that for whatever reason they were like trailblazers in documenting their life on video, right? Like nobody at that point in time did it to that extent. And how cool for those kids that there's that level of that can give you those memories. Like I know personally, like it's very sad. My brother, love my brother, but when he was young, we forgive him, but he recorded over all of the home videos. He reported The Simpsons over all of, we only had like 8 tapes, but you forget someone's voice. And it's like so powerful to have that on tape. And so, I mean, I feel like they were in their 20s, right? Like, it's not like they're young teenagers anymore. They're adults, technically, let's think. But it did kind of seem to me like maybe in the environment in which she existed in general, like even from childhood, but then, the rock and roll culture, that it's just like, there's no boundaries, like there's just like kids being exposed to things that, other parents might, greatly question. So I don't think it was the first time they saw their mother naked or, like, but yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know. I guess from my personal experience, I think what my parents did well was not pit the other one against the other. Like there was always this presentation that everybody has their version, and that's maybe what's missing, is we don't understand like what is their relationship exactly with Tommy. I think we get an idea that they still see him, but it's unclear that part. And did you guys know that she had like neither of them had anything to do with that other series? How is that even possible?
Yeah, I didn't know that.
I did know that, and I thought I'm very curious how that can happen when they.
I thought
like legally, how can that happen? And then it's almost like, it almost feels like what happened with the original tape way back when, like they have to like relive it all again. And I don't know if you guys have seen the original tape, the sex tape, but it is incredibly intimate, incredibly. And it was clearly not made to be shared publicly. It was made, they made it for each other together. And yeah, and it was just such an, and I agree with you, Megan, about they were so when I look back, I know you can't redo anything and everything's happened the way it was, but when I look back as someone who's been taking pictures for, I mean, I think I have a picture of myself holding a camera when I was like 3. And I was a scrapbooker before social media became a place where we displayed our photos, right? But I didn't grow up in a household where we had access to video cameras. But you know, there was a lot of families back in the 60s and 70s that did. So the people that grew up with that, I just think it's fascinating that they have so much footage, like you said, of all those happy times and trips and all of that. I think that's really fascinating, because you're right. I found a cassette tape at my parents' house a couple of months ago of me talking when I was like 7 or 8 years old. And my little voice is so adorable, but it's like I don't sound like that at all now, you know. But when I heard it, I recognized it as me, but it threw me because I hadn't heard it in so long. So I do think that aspect's really fascinating. The other thing that I just want to comment on to her is, you know, as women, as someone who has been in the public eye, and you know, and just feels like anybody and everybody are always critiquing the way women look and how they age. I think that she's aged beautifully. I just think she's doing it beautifully. You know, I feel like it's not forced. I feel like she hasn't like overdone it, like we might have seen some other celebrities that are like not even recognizable. I feel like she's just aged really beautifully.
Yeah, I
Well,
agree.
I felt like the whole movie at some point, like when we get to the end, like, don't you feel like was that just all a setup for the fact that she was on Broadway? You know, like, had that part of the story not happened, it would have been a very sad documentary. You would have been left with like a really sad, yeah. But I think, I mean, back to your question with the kids, like I kind of think they've probably always been, and like probably that's just a lot of having very famous parents too. It's just too much information. Like there's zero privacy in terms of what's appropriate or not to be seen. But yeah, I mean, what I have is very old pictures of my parents, even just taking a moment and being like, my God, like just to remember, you know, they were kids too, like they were young, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's so, I mean, I'm happy for them that they have that aspect of their parents' relationship. It's documented, if you will, even though they didn't live it.
I think my takeaway from the Pam and Tommy series from last year that they apparently had nothing to do with, that I thought there's a lot of different things you could talk about that series in and of itself, but I thought that the one thing that they did showcase well was you know, when this tape got leaked and then it just like went viral, even though viral wasn't even a term back then, he became even more of a rock star, but she became even more of a slut, right? And I think that and you know, fast forward, you know, all these decades later, I don't know that viewpoint that has changed. I think people still glamorize men for being like, you know, as sexually promiscuous as they want to be, but it's still, I think it's a little more acceptable with women now, but I still think it's pretty looked down upon and it's taboo, and they, you know, they still get that letter A on their chest, if you will.
Yeah, I agree. I watched the whole series, didn't know that it was against their permission. So obviously that bummed me out. But I actually really enjoyed the Pam and Tommy series, and I feel like they actually got a lot of that depiction well. Like they covered it well. When I watched the documentary, Pamela was just like, I don't want to know anything about it. I'm disgusted. I'm upset. I was kind of, well, obviously that made me sad in the sense that I don't like the fact that people that are famous get, you know, their stories used in that way, and then other people are making money off of that. Like all that stuff bothers me. But I do feel like, to the series credit, that they did try to portray her story accurately. And I do feel like that actress that played her, whose name I don't remember, did an amazing, the actor and actress that played Tommy and Pamela, I was blown away. Like it just felt so believable to me. And I didn't know that story at all. I had no idea. I knew about the sex tape, but I had no idea that it was stolen out of their home. And I thought, like, in relation to what you were sharing too about the viral part, they did such a good job of painting the picture of what was happening in the 90s with the internet and how the whole porn, aspect of the internet was still up and coming, and that was kind of what exploded it. And I didn't know that side of the story. So even if that side of the story might have not been portrayed entirely accurate or was problematic in some ways, I do think that for those that are growing up without the context of that, that are being born post 90s, it's a pretty just historically accurate thing, I think, to kind of be thinking about, like, how we got to where we are, and that was a pretty big part of it, that whole thing, which is just crazy to think about. And I think, this is a little bit of one of the things that is controversial that I think sometimes, where it's hard if you're in it probably to feel this way, but I think thanks to sometimes these things happening in such a horrendous way, that is how laws and regulations and, publishing licensing and stuff that does end up protecting people ends up coming to be, is because of these things where we don't have laws and regulations. And usually it's usually these laws happen or, things happen out of something terrible that happened to somebody else. And so obviously there's still things happening that are problematic. I mean, how many docuseries or documentary biopic stuff has been made against the wishes of people that actually went through it, like the Jeffrey Dahmer one, and I watched that whole one. Probably one of the worst things that I've ever let myself watch all of, that was like recreated for television. Like that was so traumatic to watch. And it was so well done in that way. But at the same time, it was just like the ethical part of it, And so I think that I'm glad Pamela came out with her own documentary and got to share her story more the way she did to. I didn't feel, I guess, being the closeted Pamela fan that I was, outside of the sex tape, I knew a lot about her already. So I didn't feel like I really was getting to watch something new. It felt very much like, oh, I remember watching stuff about her in the early 2000s. And this is all pretty regurgitated info for me. But the thing I really appreciated about it was where she's at now. I had no idea, what she was doing now. And I also had no idea about how she felt about things. And then the Broadway thing, I had no idea about. And then the one thing that I saw in the documentary that I was so stoked about was her storage container closet. I straight up, like, I have this little friend group that I talk to on WhatsApp every day. And I was like, straight up telling them, I was like, okay, I'm getting this minimalist shit out of my head right now. Pamela Anderson has a storage container full of all her favorite stuff. And when I outgrow my closet, like, I'm utilizing my yard and my space that I have to create a storage container of things I don't want to get rid of. Like, I just loved that so much, I thought. And she's like throwing the designer shoes in a pile. And she's like, yeah, those are expensive. And I was just like, yes.
Yeah, I feel like she's like not like she's got every single fuck me boot from like every decade. I did appreciate that. I'm not aspiring to it, no, but no, I thought it was fascinating, that bit that basically it was the first viral video. I mean, they created an aspect of the internet to share it and make money, trying to imagine like how, seems like so long ago that we were going to Blockbuster to rent VHS.
Yeah.
I mean, but yeah, I mean, I thought, well, I guess it's, I mean, I'm not the part that, they stole it and it was, but the first online porn was like between a loving couple, and like, I'm so deadly afraid of what my kids are going to eventually find one day. And it's like so far from something that's like A, real, and B, intimate, and coming out of a loving relationship. But yeah, there was like so many random parts of history that I wouldn't ever have painted or thread over there. Again, you see headlines, but you don't really understand. And just how, I think the one thing we haven't touched on is her miscarriage, and how that, again, I feel like it's a topic that's first, Elise, I was thinking about what you said about the way that it made him more a guy's guy, and it just painted her more as a slut, and that it's definitely an aspect, but I do feel, and like maybe it's because I live in a extremely liberal, Instagram bubble with lots of communities of women that are, redefining their sexuality, but I feel like what you said is still true in terms of in a political setting or a corporate setting or sort of the traditional, but there are pockets where it's getting better. But then, it's a reality. I think that the same thing is true where there's not safe spaces where women can say like, the way she told it, it's not like she was even aware that she should be working less and that was going to be risking her pregnancy, and it was unclear exactly like how directly, but I mean, it seemed based on the type of work and the hours, it was just completely out of line with someone that was pregnant. But yeah, that it's just like not okay for women, or women feel that it's still a risk to talk about that they need more space or time or some sort of allowance for either being pregnant or recovering from a miscarriage, like I think she said she like basically went back to work right away.
Yeah. The other thing about that is with her, she was never treated like a serious actress, which is what she actually really wanted to be, but they could never get past what she looked like outwardly to even appreciate the fact that she did have talent to being an actress, but she was never going to get that shot. And I think the thing that stood out to me at the beginning of this, when you were reading her start chart as a fellow Cancer, and obviously I can't identify with being any other sign because I've only ever been a Cancer my whole life, but like Cancers, at least the ones that I know, and speaking for myself, when we're hurt, we are notoriously like devastatedly broken, and we were tracked into our little shell, our little crab shell, and it takes us a really long time to come back out, if we ever fully come back out after getting hurt in a situation. And so when you talked about the fact that she was like chasing love and just wanting to be loved, and she was just never seen for who she truly was on the inside, really, because people were always just taking her at the face value of what they saw on the outside, and just idolizing the beauty, which she's a beautiful woman, but I think she also is wildly talented and beautiful on the inside too.
Yeah, it feels like an age-old tale for a lot of women that get hypersexualized, like Marilyn Monroe and a lot of the Playboy kind of people that kind of tried to do certain things in that way. And I think that the downfall of the culture up until very recently has been that we don't have advocacy for women in many spaces. And so I feel like, there's a lot that's changed behind the scenes on sets because of the Harvey Weinstein stuff and these kinds of men running the show and these things, the cancel culture, that even though I really don't like cancel culture, I think it's a necessary evil that we have to go through in order to, create these better systems within the entertainment industry. Because I mean, as a musician, and, my path as a musician, I was getting up in those kind of tiers of where it was getting, like at the kind of lower levels of being a professional musician and being in these circles with people who are famous and working with the top, I met people and was surrounded by people in the top tier of the music industry. And that was my trajectory. That was what I wanted. And the stuff that I experienced as a teenager, the abuse, the sexual abuse, the mental abuse, all of that. It's just, you think that these women that are this famous have all this power and have the ability to, overcome that or do these things. But the reality of it is that if you're a famous woman, like pre-2012, you're playing a game and you have to eat a lot of shit. And if you're in that world, especially if you have big tits and you're already hypersexualized, that stuff's happening to you on a regular basis and there's nothing you can do about it. Like, you just have to eat it. And that's been the facts for a really long time up until very recently. So it makes sense to me that a lot of women, especially during the 90s, just kind of kept going at it. And because that's what you were told, you're like, this is just, it's like, you don't have a voice, you don't get to be upset, you don't get to, nobody cares, nobody cares about marriage, nobody cares you're pregnant. Nobody cares that you were molested or raped by this guy. Like nobody cares.
Yeah.
Even other women don't care. They're like, yeah, we're all doing it, you know? So I think a lot of the women that have been in the entertainment world, it's just, I have a lot of empathy for what you have to do to be a part of it and keep being a part of it while also all the shit you have to eat, you know? Because I think somebody like Pamela probably watching this world now, she's like, wow, that probably would have been really nice to have had some, you know, for being pregnant or, you know, having domestic violence. Like there's just nobody cared about. And then it's like too, like looking at Motley Crue, I'm sure a lot of people during that time were also like, yeah, it's Tommy Lee. So I think that kind of stuff happens to women a lot. Like that's kind of happening to Lala from Vanderpump Rules with her Randall husband. I don't know if you guys watch Vanderpump Rules, but everybody's looking at Lala and they're just like, it's so obvious that that was what was going to happen to you in this relationship. And she, who knows if she is just as what to blame, but everybody sees her as like a blonde, you know, fake boob person. So yeah, it's an interesting conversation though, because it's like the way our society paints what women we should value or, you know, treat in a certain way. And I think that the blonde bimbo is always kind of getting abused. Like that's like a stereotypical thing in the entertainment world that seems to be a story happening for a long, like since early Hollywood.
Yeah.
You know,
speaking of that, and one thing I wished would have been more in the documentary a little bit, but is, you know, with Pamela being in Playboy and being at the mansion, I, you know, because I was obsessed with big boob blonde women, like The Girls Next Door, when that came out in the I think late 2000s, I was totally watching that show all of the time. And so what I've been fascinated with in the last couple of months is the things that are coming out now that Hef has passed, like all these playmates that are coming out and finally speaking their truth. I think it's interesting they waited till he was dead to talk about it. And then from that series, another series spawned off a true crime series of all these murders that were like attached to the Playboy Mansion.
Yeah.
So like, I just, you know, but as far as I can tell in what I've Googled, you know, Pamela has not, that I can tell, I think she's only spoken kindly of Hef. But I would be interested, you know, if she were to call us and be like, you guys, thanks so much for having such an awesome conversation about me today. I'd love to talk to you more about my personal life. Like if that happened, that would be something I would want to ask her.
Yeah, no, that whole series.
Very briefly commented on it. And I mean, one thing that I just loved about her, in particularly the documentary, but I feel like that's maybe like what I liked about her a lot. Like she just told it like it was. And back then, like nobody spoke to the press like that, just being like, I am what I am. Like she didn't pretend to be anything she wasn't. I mean, the back is of course esteemed to be respected on a different level, but she wasn't pretending she was an intellectual. She wasn't, you know, she was just like, and the way that she told the story of how she first got, you know, invited and like couldn't even go across the border and like, yeah, I think she was just really young. It's unclear, like, she was always involved in Playboy, or it seemed like part of the beginning dream. You know, she just kind of seemed starstruck by the whole experience, I think. But I'm sure she saw some crazy shit.
She grew up in a teeny tiny town, like on Vancouver Island, right?
Well, that was the other fascinating bit. Can you believe? I think I understood. Like, she lives in the house she grew up.
Yeah. Which is wild to me. That's wild. Yeah. Because let's be clear, she has options.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's super wild.
Anyway, cool. I really enjoyed it. And I wish I'll see if I can get access to that other series.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I think it's worth a watch. So for anyone that's watched to the end of this video, like, we're giving it a thumbs up. We think it's worth a watch, and we appreciate you watching us.
One more astrology thing I forgot to mention that those who are into astrology might find fascinating is that Pamela got together with Tommy during her Saturn return. And so that was another very karmic thing that I thought was interesting tidbit. So
Can you explain
They're
to
like
me what that
7
means?
years.
Yeah, what does that mean?
So every 28 years, Saturn comes back to where it was. Saturn has like a 27 and a half-ish year cycle. And so everyone at the age of sometime between 27 and 29 goes through their first Saturn return. And then you have another one in your late 50s. And Saturn is the planet that represents consequences from previous actions. It also, like I said, it represents kind of the paternal structure, traditions, rules, boundaries. And so that late 20s is kind of like the put up or shut up time where the hammer's coming down. It's time to grow up. It's time to be an adult. And the things you got away with when you were in your early 20s, you don't get away with post Saturn return. So it's kind of like the first little taste of what it means to really have to grow up and start being responsible and, you know, doing things in your life. And so what's common for people in their Saturn return is for a big life change. So they either get married, or if they are married, they get divorced, or if they're with a long-term partner, something shifts in that way. It's common for people to move or to like completely uproot life. That's what you did?
Yeah, I was like the end of 29, but yeah, I decided shortly after my Saturn returns that this was a good idea.
Yeah, totally. So that's really common for a lot of people. And then depending on what sign and placement is in your chart, that'll be the themes kind of around your Saturn return. So some people have Saturn returns that are really easy because their Saturn is in a really positive place. And some people have Saturn returns that are just super destructive because Saturn is in a really difficult place. And obviously, if you know that your Saturn return is happening, you can look at your chart and figure out like where to lean into it. But either way, it's just a really transformative time. And so the 20s one is that one. And then the one that happens in your late 50s is the one that is kind of like your last little bit of youth before you start really facing mortality, which is what Saturn also can kind of represent, is aging and time. And so people in their late, their second Saturn return tend to be coming to terms with retirement, or it's looked at as the crone cycle is starting. So you're leaving childhood in the first Saturn return, and then the second one you're entering crone wisdom status. So just the fact that she, you know, met Tommy and got married right away, and then they had, you know, this whole whirlwind romance that started in her Saturn return is just interesting, you know, because we see people just have really intense life changes happen during that time. My husband got together with me during his Saturn return. Yeah, I know.
Well, one last thing I wanted to touch on, I feel like we could speak to a little bit more, was how Tommy changed too because of the addiction, right?
Yeah.
So everything that you kind of like foreshadowed in his chart, it's like he was managing before the addiction took it over, right? I think that's very common.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've talked about the Sagittarius energy that has a really hard time kind of like reining things in and being grounded, and kind of that constant seek for, you know, peak experiences. And he has that Sagittarius moon, and then he's got Libra. He doesn't have a lot of earth energy in his chart. So earth is that element that like really anchors and grounds us in reality and in the practical side of life. And they both lacked a lot of that. But her chart, the North Node in Taurus, wants her to learn that. Like she's supposed to be learning how to be more grounded and stable, which, you know, I think looking at her chart, if she's not aware of that, then and she's still kind of chasing the Gemini Aries.
Uh-oh. We lost her.
I feel like she found her grounding in motherhood, right? Like she started to make grounded decisions quickly.
Yeah, I think so.
Just over boys.
Well, on that note, I think technology has decided that we're done with this conversation. But we thank you for watching, and tune in next time for whatever we decide to review next.